Thank you so much, Annie, and thank you to Fanny Gay also for organizing this, and to, of course, Christia Mercer for inviting us. This event is sponsored by the Maison Française, as well as the Department of Philosophy, to which we are very grateful. So we are thrilled that you are here, familiar faces and new faces. We are going to talk to you about Louise Dupin and the forgotten feminist Enlightenment. We're going to start by jumping in to a newspaper article from 1958. This article was authored by Bernard Gagnebin, who would go on to become one of the co-editors of Rousseau's complete works in the Pléiade edition. At this time, he was the conservator of manuscripts and rare books at the Bibliothèque de Genève. And he's writing in a very alarmist mode. You see this, academics aren't prone to using exclamation points. But he is writing in this alarmist mode, which turns out actually to be a little bit of a clickbait, because what he's saying here, right? 3,000 pages of Rousseau dispersed at auction. So this is a calamity. But it's actually not that bad, because it's not actually Rousseau. It's just his handwriting. And what is being dispersed is the work of Madame Dupin, qui se piquait de littérature, who thought she could write literature, is what Gagnebin says here. So there's two things to note. Gagnebin is very distressed that what is getting away from people potentially is the ability to know what Rousseau had been working on and thinking about in the 6 years before he became famous. Rousseau was Dupin's secretary from 1745 to 1751, and he says very little about this period in his Confessions, and particularly about his work for her. It's something, he keeps very quiet about that. And so what is lost, according to Gagnebin, is clues as to Rousseau's intellectual development. What else is a problem, potentially, is that people might, unscrupulous dealers, might try to pass off as Rousseau's work, des inédits de Rousseau, what is really just Dupin. So there's no really interest or curiosity as to what Dupin herself might have been doing in this work. And this is pretty typical, and something that will characterize the reception of her, or non-reception of her work as it is, and that she herself could have predicted.
So this next slide you have also on your handout. It's a list of the current archives that hold pieces of Dupin's manuscripts. The top 3 are those that have the largest chunks of manuscripts, and I hope that's on the handout. If it's not, I apologize. What happened to collect all of this together was, after the auctions happened, or right before the auctions happened, rather, a man named Anicet Sénéchal was tasked by the heirs to catalog all of these papers before they were sold off. And so he did so, and then he published an article about what was in them in 1965. And the things he emphasizes, of course, are the contours of the work, Rousseau's reading notes, which are voluminous as part of this project. An interesting aspect is that his cataloging system is one that future scholars stuck with, right? So how he cataloged it stuck throughout the 20th and 21st century. The unfortunate bit about that is simply that if a piece only had Dupin's handwriting for a series of pages, and it wasn't obviously connected to another piece that had some of Rousseau's handwriting, he did not catalog it. So these pieces then were called later outside the inventory. So future scholars did catalog them and then include them, but it's an interesting moment to see the erasure of Dupin herself from the catalog of her works. So I will let you go next.
So let's take just a few looks at some of the manuscripts, just to give you an idea, and we've included a couple of these in your handout. What you have right here is an example of what we would consider kind of a more finished draft. This is, you see it's a big folio that was folded in half and served as kind of a folder. It's got a title written on it. De l'éducation looks like a cat print. I don't think it really is. And a number and a paraphe, that squiggly thing, that indicates, you know, this is a title. This is what Dupin would call an article. And so some of these are very finished. Some of them are not so much. You see also those two holes on the right, indicating that this was probably closed with string. So although these were likely stacked horizontally, like lasagna, they wouldn't have, the vertical filing system was invented like in the late 19th century, I think. But it did kind of serve that purpose, because the folios within it she never bound anything, like it was just loose leaf, and she could move them around as she decided that this little tidbit should be somewhere else. There are a total of, we think, or she was planning on a total of 47 of these articles. Here is an example of a folio. So these all look variations of this. This is a very simple one, the kind of thing when we turned the page and got this, we're like, yay, this will be easy to transcribe. You see the pages are generally divided in two columns, and the most writing generally happens on the right. That's Rousseau's handwriting there, very easy to read, very lovely. And you see a little bit on the left, an addition that Dupin's making. There's like a little line, and then a line indicating where that should go, tel qu'il est maintenant. You see also an M with a line over it. That's her. She had a lot of shorthand kind of symbols. That means mais. So she's adding a mais that probably continued something from a previous page. She's linking these together, and you see a big cross out. She's like, nah, not here at least. Here's an example from Article 45 on the spirit of general conversation. You have our translation of this in one of your quotes, and you also, I think, have an image of this folio. Slightly more complicated, still pretty easy to decipher. Do you see the plus mark on the right? And then the plus mark over here, that's telling us where we're going to add in this chunk that Dupin has decided needs to go in this section. And here's a slightly more complicated, this would make us really unhappy when we got something like this. Like, where do we even start? So anyway, that's, yeah.
Okay, so we are not the only people who have tried to put these manuscripts together. And you see one of the folks featured here. This is Frédéric Marty, and in front of him in the yellow is his edition, the French edition of Dupin's work. It's titled Des Femmes in his edition, and he was working on this for his PhD thesis while we were also working on ours. We were working in parallel, not together, but we did make connections, and of course since then have really come to appreciate his work and shared some connections there. And in addition, there were a few small pieces, small articles that had been published separately in the 20th century that folks had edited. So it wasn't impossible to read some bits of Dupin in the mid to three-quarters of the 20th century. But Frédéric's is the first edition in French and tries to be a complete edition in 22, and ours, as you know, has this title and its selections. And we try to represent each of the kind of broad areas that Dupin discusses in her book in our selection. So some are from the section on science, a section on history and religion, one on law, and then another on education and mores, generally speaking.
So because literary historians of philosophy tend to view women who run salons, Dupin was a very wealthy high society lady, as bel esprit at best. So kind of, yes, dabbling in literature as as Bernard Gagnebin puts it. We are very committed to emphasizing that she is a philosopher. So in what ways is she a philosopher? So we could start with political philosophy. She is not unusual in saying that marriage is the foundation of society. So an absolutist political theorist like Jean Baudin or somebody like John Locke or Pufendorf would say the same thing, except that in their versions, generally the foundation of society is the wife's submission to the husband, right? That is kind of the first building block of civil society. And Dupin is challenging that. She's saying, well, if that's the way it is, that doesn't mean it's just. And she describes marriage as a partnership, la société de mariage, in terms of like a business partnership. Almost you could see it that way when you think about the resources that are at play, and that's what marriage really is at this time, is a kind of way of transferring resources. But this contract, the marriage contract, has the particularity of not living up to what a contract should be. An enforceable contract is one in which the two parties, each have something to gain. And any contract in which that is not the case can be thrown out, right, as null and void. And this is exactly how she describes the marriage contract. Oh, yeah, and there's a few quotes to give you a sense of how she's making this, how she's seeing this. So your first quote, on your handout. In the first quote, she's just showing kind of how, like a vignette of what marriage is at the altar. It looks all official. It's made official by a priest who sprinkles some magic here and there. And it becomes, this legally permanent bond. And yet what is actually happening is the usurpation of one party's assets by the other. And so, again, not what we would consider a contract. In the second quote, she's emphasizing the modernity. So one of her major methodological strategies is to show that, is to argue against the principle of universal consent, in which, well, regardless of whether it's natural or not, everybody everywhere has always believed this, so that it must be true. Everybody believes this. So she is saying, no, this is a contingency of French society in the early modern period. It hasn't been like this over time everywhere. So she's emphasizing the modernity of this injustice. And in the third quote, you can see she's kind of riffing on Montesquieu, whose work was published, Esprit des Lois was published in 1748. And she's emphasizing the difference between what is legal and what is just. So even though a marriage may be, legal, this marriage contract, this transfer of assets may be entirely legal, it is not just.
Another aspect of her philosophy is moral philosophy. And one of the important things she shows there is how this concept she uses, called masculine vanity, really controls and dominates and distorts domains of knowledge like science and history and law. And what happens is that men aggrandize themselves and diminish women through masculine vanity, sometimes in history at least, to the point of erasing them from the record altogether. And the quotes you have here are from two different sections on the handout, but the first one is from the science side, where she kind of gives us the first definition of masculine vanity. And here she's talking about strength and the idea that really men being stronger than women isn't proven, but the little bit of it that may be true, that men create a great edifice of their domination out of that seemingly small difference, and then add to it a kind of belief in intellectual superiority to justify to themselves this usurpation. And in the science section, just as an aside, that's somewhat related to this, she really focuses on how a kind of confirmation bias is what we would say has been infiltrated throughout science from the ancients to the present day. She spends a lot of time directly dealing with figures like Heister, who's an anatomist, and Hermann Boerhaave, and John Freund, who's English, and really goes through their works and shows how even though they're making great strides in science, right, experiments and new techniques are being used, they still are bringing along these prejudices, this masculine vanity that is harming their understanding of the world. It's because it builds in the assumption of women's inequality, both physically, morally, and intellectually. And so she engages directly with their works to surface that and to make it visible. And her concept of masculine vanity comes somewhat from the moralist tradition and from François Poulain de la Barre and folks like that are talking about amour propre, self-interest, self-love. But she pushes it further, that it's really this psychological motivation to avoid any evidence that would show some kind of equality, and that in fact reinforces the idea that an artificial and instituted difference between men and women is there naturally to be found. And then she calls it, she doesn't use these terms, we did, but self-pleasuring, right? That there's an enjoyment in seeing this and seeing it to be this way, so much so that the science is tainted by these kind of crude remarks about the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom and how she-goats and billy goats relate to each other, just importing a whole bunch of sexist bias into it, seemingly unawares. In the second quote you have from the history section, she talks about historians as well and how they approach their subject and how they see bad deeds or vices of particular women rulers as an implication for all women that can be generalized for the way they are, whereas it's not the case when they see faults and problems and vices in male rulers. And that instead what happens is this kind of systemic way in which you get from history examples for behavior. For example, and for the men, it's virtues that can be emulated, and for the women, it's either negative things to be avoided that are difficult since it's part of your supposed very nature, or lessons in subordination. And in the education section, she really goes through some of these aspects of differing education for boys and girls to show that continual lesson being enforced.
So in a way, just as Pierre Force here wrote about self-interest before Adam Smith, we have a kind of moralist concept, vanity, being mapped onto groups and showing how vanity is creating relations of dominance or maintaining, relations of dominance and subordination. So something that was a concept of the moralist was more psychological and behavioral is now political. And so this brings us to the realm of feminist philosophy, where she is really showing through all these discourses how these relations of domination and subordination are maintained and perpetuated. And you see in the final quote we have for you, she's talking about how my daughter just arrived, so hello. Just in casual conversation, right? Just the kind of how men maintain dominance in casual interactions and change the subject when it doesn't suit their interests, and so reinforcing, perpetuating the power differences between men and women. And this is just kind of some dates for you in case you're curious about her life. She was the Châtelaine de Chenonceau. Chenonceau is a castle most people have seen in the Loire Valley, so everybody gets excited about that. We try to focus on the philosophy, okay? But we can answer questions. We do know stuff about her life if you're curious about that. But I think Christia Mercer is going to have some questions for us, possibly? Okay.
This is this wonderful book, and I'm the co-editor of the book series in which this it's recently appeared, and I was looking at my emails over the past many years, and I found the email that the first couple emails I got from these people. And they said, you know, we found these writings, and there's this amazing woman, Dupin, and you know, she had Rousseau as a secretary, you know, the story. And I remember, I don't think I've ever told you this, but I thought, either this is so amazing, or these people have lost their minds. You know, this is like they're on serious narcotics or something. But of course, it was the former, not the latter, or as far as I know, not the latter as well. But it was a long time in coming, because it was, you know, as you can imagine, it was so hard to kind of put this material together. We went back and forth for a very long time about footnotes, because, you know, one of the problems about being so erudite as they are is, and knowing all the stuff that they know, is they wanted to make reference to sort of absolutely everything important, and however wonderful that is, the book needed to be less than 500 pages, so it might be teachable, and we want to sell some books. And so, speaking of, by the way, there's a barcode. Where have those gone?
They're on the table.
Yeah. Okay. There's barcodes on the table where you can order a book and you get a discount. So, and I'm hoping that more and more people will start teaching this material. So I have a couple of questions. And but first of all, I'm just struck by, I think I kind of had noticed this before in reading through the text, but in talking about her male vanity, this is such a good example of what feminist philosophers of science have called standpoint theory. So, you know, one of the ways of making sure that you are creating as objective a science as you can make is to make sure that you have people with various standpoints, with various views of the world. And you simply cannot have good science if you have a number of people who have their own, who share a standpoint of power, and in this case, masculinity, and maybe sexism. So this is another example, I hadn't really thought about this before, of her being way ahead of her time. So anyway, just wanted to get that out there. So I'm really curious. One of the questions that came to mind to ask you to is how has your collaboration influenced your understanding of the collaboration between Dupin and Rousseau? And I know enough about, I mean, these two didn't know one another, as I understand it, right? Until each heard that the other was working on Dupin, and they both just, of course, as people, some people, mostly women people, tend to do, is they decided to collaborate. And so I'm curious to know how you understood your own collaboration in relation to that collaboration.
That's a really interesting question. I think I can take this one. So our collaboration was obviously very egalitarian. I think that is most obvious in our translation process, where we would divide labor in some sense, like you do this, you begin with this chapter, I begin with this chapter, but we would go through, I would go through one I was pink ink, I think, and you were blue, yeah. And then Angela would come through, I'd leave what I was sort of not sure about. She would come in with the blue, because Dupin's a very terse, in some ways, writer, and sort of the temptation to unpack it all was very great for me. Like, I wanted to absolutely get the meaning right, and Angela brought me back multiple times to more to style and to being elusive, a more elusive style. And so we would go, our translation process was 3 times through, depending. So we'd go, one of us would start the second one, and then we'd sit down together side by side, usually on a couch, and hash out the last bits. So that was absolutely egalitarian. Then there was some division of labor with, footnotes, writing introductions, but we both had kind of oversight over each other's work, and constantly intervening in each other's work. So I think that's truly collaboration, right? What Rousseau and Dupin were doing was not collaboration in that sense. He was very definitely working for her. It was a very hierarchical relation. He was getting paid, so I don't think about that in terms of collaboration. What I do, I think this process has made me realize, or it's kind of changed my way of approaching things. I tend to now approach literature, cultural production, philosophy, not from the assumption that it is written by a single author, but I kind of start from the standpoint, I just assume that it's collaborative until proven otherwise, or it's involved multiple agents in any case, and that, so the text is. And also, if you think about the text, how it was made, not just what it has in it, it's not just a container of ideas. And I think that way of thinking about literary or philosophical production opens things a lot to things that were previously invisible. So yeah, we have very different ways of working relationships, me and Angela and Dupin and Rousseau, but overall, I'd say I'm much more attuned to the multiplicity behind the single production.
Right, thank you. No, and one of the reasons I was prompted to ask the question is that you had said something about this when you got the prize, and just how there was something like a connection, that you understood that collaboration a tiny bit better, but obviously was entirely different. Okay, so let me, I'm just struck, and I know there's some students in the crowd who have been thinking about Enlightenment matters. And there are other women writing in the Enlightenment. Some of them are more or less feminist. So I'm curious to know how you sort of see these writings as distinctive. And of course, one of the ways they're distinctive is that, it's not a final text. You've had to decide what to include, and I think not everything could be included. So I guess there's 2 questions here. One is just about the criterion for inclusion and even the order of things. You were talking a good deal at one point about how to order the materials. Mm-hmm. And then the other question is just difference. And if you think that she's distinctive as a feminist in a way.
So I'll go ahead and start with this one, although I want to plant a quick flag because it's about the second half of your question about the distinctive. One of the major distinctions really, I think, is how she deals with her sources and the sources she's using and the way she's interacting directly with other thinkers. So I'll come back to that. Mm-hmm. First, I'll start with the unfinished aspect of the book, right? How do you decide what was complete and what wasn't? Especially given that Sénéchal kind of laid a path that explained some pieces, but they went missing. So they are not currently in existence. So things that he had seen and described, 17 folios on this, and he would always give the first line, again, if it was something that seemed complete or that had some of Rousseau's hand in it. And some of those we just don't have today. They could be in private hands, not yet known, or they could just be missing, like someone's grandparent, they inherited it and they don't know that it's a valuable manuscript. If you know anyone who has some 18th century manuscripts that they can't quite place, we're constantly seeing little pieces come to auction. Rebecca has friends that send notices to it. Mm-hmm. Often it's notes or things that we've already heard about. I'm sure someday it'll be something really, really great. So in that context, making those decisions, like what to include, some things we know were complete in her mind or close to it. So the Partie Physique articles 1 through 5 that are on science, she numbered them. Many of them were numbered, but she gave it a name. She called it the Partie Physique. It's written. We have early drafts, middling drafts, and clean copies. So that seems pretty clear. After that, there's some text where she describes what she's planning to do generally, and so you can kind of map it by that. We also had to map things based on the numbering system, but oddly, we found pieces that seemed complete and could be a chapter or at least a subsection of a chapter on their own, but it had no number, and it would relate to one that was numbered, and so we had to decide, well, what do you include? The numbered ones, obviously, usually Rousseau would have numbered those. They would have been pretty far in the work, right? Because the early messy drafts are often her hand alone. Not in all cases, but frequently. So we left out pieces, and we tried to talk about it in the footnotes when it happened. That seemed like there's something that exists that is more complete on this subject, but it's not clear that she intended it to go here. And then what she does have in some cases may be just some fragments, some quotes from Rousseau's reading notes that she was planning to drop in. Rebecca explained the kind of mobile manuscript, the folios, that didn't get sewn in well, that she hadn't yet fully integrated. Since we did selections, we got the easy job of saying, well, we can either deal with some of those and describe the state of it because it's interesting, it's part of the process, and we can also choose some of those that are more complete. That as long as we're giving broad range, ones that show both the best aspects of her work and some of the flaws. And it's interesting to look at Frédéric Marty's edition. He too had some of the same problems, but of course he was trying to do a complete edition. And what do you do with some of those stubs that seem more complete than something that is a soi-disant chapter? So it was really an interesting puzzle. And following where she kind of laid little pieces, she did leave little kind of connections for things that were helpful in works that were called like preliminary discourses that were to the side but described her overall project, what she was attempting to do, and those were helpful. Okay, to come back to the question of
how do you see her as being different to? Yeah,
I kind of mentioned this with the partie physique, which is one of my pet parts, as you can probably tell, because I talk about it a lot. But I do think that direct criticism of not just previous scholars, so not just Aristotelians and medical knowledge, but currently living, well-known, well-recognized scholars, that she takes them on directly, quotes their work, criticizes them directly in all of these domains side by side. So she doesn't just do it in science. She does it in law. She does it in the section on education. She critiques Fenelon. She critiques Fontenelle, who was a very close friend of hers. He might have been dead by the time she wrote that part. And she mentions his work, not his name, and she gives it a bit of faint praise before going on to the critique. So I feel in some ways, some of that is just that breadth of those discourses that she takes on, her willingness to make her own arguments, but to also rope in others, which may be one of the reasons she ultimately decided not to publish it. Some of that is quite risky. To be mocking. And in some cases, she does use ridicule against some of these folks. So the risks were great. Even some of her friends made some pretty snarky remarks about her project that knew about it. So you can imagine what the people she was critiquing might think. What does she think she knows about my reading of Roman law, for example?
So I think this is very, very interesting. I mean, one thing I will just say is that when I was a graduate student, I spent a year, way too long, maybe even a year and a half, in the Leibniz archives, where people working on Leibniz's papers, and he was like a crazy person in the sense that he just wrote all the time. And those people, the editors of his materials, had been doing this for decades. I mean, people came and went as editors, but you're making so many hard decisions about how to organize notes. And I mean, Leibniz wrote texts. I mean, most of them are pretty short, but a lot of them are just like a comment on something. And so that's just noteworthy. I mean, it's really hard work, as I don't have to tell you, but I just want to make it clear that this is really hard work. But the other thing that is really striking to me, and again, I'm by no means an expert, but is how authoritative her voice often is. I mean, even Wollstonecraft, I mean, there's times when, she's kind of arguing often against, Rousseau, as you know, but but there's still there's still a kind of hesitancy sometimes. And with Dupin, I just feel that here's a topic, she has an opinion. Here's a topic, she has an opinion. And do you think do you think the authoritative voice is somewhat distinctive?
Yeah, I think she's trying very hard. It's not so much in the body of the work on women, but in one of the preliminary discourses that she wrote. She is trying to position herself as really like a view from nowhere, kind of that philosophical view. Because she says if one party does this and the other party does that, she's kind of positioning herself above sort of two conflicting parties, men and women, like with their different claims. It's also kind of a skeptical move, right? Of opposing arguments and suspending judgment. So she's kind of like putting herself in a very, objective, very objective position, which is unusual for women, and using the I, the philosophical I, the first person, quite easily. So she's assuming a philosophical stance, or what would have been considered, a philosophical stance. So that is, I think, quite different.
And I really like that idea of a view from nowhere. I think that's really the right way to say it. Yeah.
And I do think the idea that authoritative voice, again, in all of these domains, it's not just about women's education, or it's not just issues about women, which people writing about these issues often focused on the detriment of women's education and how it could be better, or kind of some of the political issues of the time. But she really took that authoritative mode, and sometimes quite snarkily, again, in this broad range of discourses, which she did educate herself in to be able to do that, right? She wasn't dilettanting around, and Rousseau was very busy making tons of extracts from great number of volumes that she used to go find the quotes that she needed and to find the places she wanted to interject.
I just wanted to tell people, I mean, again, it's just such a wonderful collection of comments, but on page 40, in Article 1, Observations on the Equality of the Sexes and on Their Difference, and there's just the first line underneath it, there is no master I'm bound to swear loyalty to.
Right, her epigraph.
So do you, this is maybe, so I have a confession to make, speaking of confessions. So I'm a big fan of Augustine's Confessions, in the sense that I think Augustine's a very problematic person, but it's brilliant. And I'm kind of a fan of Rousseau's Confessions, same thing. But his work on education and what he says about women there, I might think that he didn't learn as much as he might have from her about the authoritative voice and seriousness and capacity of women. So if you have, I think maybe just a few sentences are in order, and then we should open it up a bit, and we can talk about this in the question period if you want to.
Yeah, I'll take that. So Christia's mentioning Rousseau's treatise on education, which is Emile, and it's the fictionalized kind of story of a kid's coming of age and how he's supposed to be educated, and so it's sort of a prolonged thought experiment. And in the fifth part, he's gets around to women and what women's education or girls' education should be. And it's long been, targeted by feminists for being very sexist. Okay. But what I think is so interesting is that he is arguing against Dupin very clearly there. There's certain phrases that come around, certain examples, like after reading Dupin, some things that sound uncannily familiar. So he's arguing with her and yet not saying he's arguing with her. So she doesn't even get the credit for being his punching bag, So it's an intriguing experience to reread the Emile after reading Dupin.
That's super interesting. I didn't realize the connection.
I was just going to say also, we tried to put we cut down a lot of the footnotes, as Christia has already told you, but we did retain some in the fourth section on education and mores, really, where we quote from Emile and other Rousseau texts, just as and without really any context, just as a counterposition to, like, here's her line, and here's something he said about it that is strikingly different, to kind of just show and surface some of those later tensions. Right, and this you may see why he didn't describe what kind of work he was helping her write in Confessions. He's quite vague about what her project is that he's serving on. So he's not eager later to own it as something he's thought through seriously. It appears he really didn't think it deserved serious thought. Although I will say I'm a huge Rousseau fan. I have Rousseau tattooed on my arm and all of that. So everybody has their allegiances, and sometimes they're contradictory. But they did remain friends. They were the lifelong friends for all of Rousseau's life. She outlived him by quite a bit. But so I will say that she didn't begrudge him that.
I just want to say I think that there's this stuff here of a really great screenplay, but
or a historical novel.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's open it up to questions. Yes.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
Oh, we have a mic. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
This has been wonderful. It's really, I mean, I know about your book, but this has given me a new perspective on it. So thank you. And I have my students here from my Radical Enlightenment Women class, and so I want to encourage all of them to ask questions. My question would be, I really appreciate the way you're insisting on her role as a philosopher. And as you know, for Madame du Deffand, I've been trying to sort of make similar arguments with that. What I wanted to ask you is how our definition of philosophy would change if we look at philosophy through, or a philosophe, if we look at it through Dupin as opposed to some of the other more familiar figures. And I guess that's a question one could ask more generally for the series.
Yeah.
And related to that, you mentioned her role as a salonière, a salon hostess. And again, I'm very interested in the question of, how that role impacts the idea of philosophy. And I think we're at a kind of very interesting point in salon criticism, because Antoine Lilti kind of made the argument that women are not intellectual beings in the salons, as I see it. And that has been largely supported and accepted and embraced in the historiographical scholarship. So how does her role as a salonière change her work, or how do you see it at play in the written work and sort of the definition of philosophy? So pick whatever you want among that, but those would be the things I've been thinking about. Thank you so much for this.
Okay. Want to go first? Or I will.
You go first.
Okay. So about the salon thing, I too am really interested in the salon criticism, and not just for my little side fiction project. But I do think that, I just blanked what I was about to say. I apologize. Thinking about her as a philosopher through the salon, that. No, you have to go first. I completely blanked.
All right.
Sorry.
So the first part of your question was, how does considering Dupin as a philosopher change our idea of what philosophy is? That's a tough one.
I have something to say.
Go for it.
Yes.
I mean, so one of the things that's really so important about the book series is that so many women wrote amazing works of fill in the blank that are philosophical and that have not been deemed so. So for what it's worth, I have a paper showing that Descartes' cogito argument, cogito sum as it is in the Meditations, I could go into more about, those, the evil deceiver argument, they're in Teresa of Avila, who he would have known really well as a boy in a Jesuit school. She had just been canonized. And, it's not surprising that he would take her views and reinvent them. Now, that doesn't diminish his importance as a philosopher, but in some sense, but he did not invent the cogito argument. That was kind of, that story was made up in the 18th century. So, but I've had some very serious philosophers, like there's a very famous philosopher at NYU who works on skepticism, and he wanted to include something about Teresa in a book on skepticism, and he read the article, and then he read her, and he was like, but Christia, where are the arguments? And the fact is, she's a nun writing in the meditative tradition, but she has a little skirmish of an argument, and then, it's like, oh, my sisters, it's just so hard. And so it's a different form of writing. It's a different way of creating authority. And so, and with Dupin's case, then, there are flourishes, really brilliant things, points made. She's very aggressive in a way. But of course, if you're going to be aggressive, you can't then publish it. And if you are going to publish it, as Teresa was allowed to do, and there are times when she wasn't allowed to, by the way, but she was allowed to exactly because she made it in very subtle ways, not philosophical. So I think once you include women, or formerly, we have some books in the book series of formerly enslaved Americans, who are writing letters and different writing in different forms. You have to broaden the genres that count as philosophy and do a different kind of reading. So that, to me, is one of the things that's really important about the book series, and especially about this, because her work is so authoritative at times. But again, she didn't publish this stuff.
Yeah, and that's, I think I would sort of, it's not how what philosophy is changes, but how we study philosophy, maybe, because typically philosophy is viewed as this very narrow conversation, like Leibniz is responding to Descartes and Kant is, right? And so influence is really important. But I tend to see it as the other influence suggests like there's this vector of, like pushing forward. But in fact, it's not that way. It's that people decide to be influenced, right? It's a reception. And so who is deemed worthy to receive? So this is the case for, right, Rousseau. With Dupin, he had no desire to claim anything. His argument about the social contract, the critique of the social contract, is him adapting Dupin's critique of the marriage contract. It's usurpation. It's fraudulent. So his discourse on the origin of inequality among men is kind of his reworking of Dupin's critique of the marriage contract. But he would never say that, right? He would not want to be influenced, God forbid, by a woman. That is the opposite of philosophy. It's the opposite of being rational, is to be influenced by a woman. So I guess it's like how philosophy works and how we consider how philosophy gets built. That's what kind of interests me more with this case.
And I remember what I was going to say, and I'll be brief. That really, I think in the part on mores, one of the things that Dupin is really looking at is kind of systemic social power and how it works. And so she looks at conversations, right? That's one of the chapters, is about everyday conversations. Some of them seem to be salon conversations. And how these things influence our understanding, not to look at how different people are or to write social satires the way things have been done before, but to really lay out something that she sees as a systemic issue. So it's at the everyday level of why men and women in marriages miscommunicate so much, right? She explores at that level of it. And does that rise to the level of philosophy? Well, it's not a witty little satire of men and women can be like this, really. It's trying very hard to implant this much larger social critique. And I think that if at the time it wouldn't have been recognized as philosophy, I think it can't not be critical of some of the projects that were ongoing. And I know there's a great anecdote where they're talking about Montesquieu in a salon, and it's a salon of a famille générale, a tax farmer, which she wasn't the only wife of a tax farmer who had a salon, but I think it's talking about hers, and everybody's going around the room and talking about l'esprit des lois. And women are quoted as having, what their opinions are. And so just to think about Lilti, one of the questions there is, philosophy was happening in conversation. And it wasn't just happening by what people were saying. It was literally happening by people looking around and saying, hey, what are the social dynamics in this room? Where's the power? And not everyone was going back to their room and writing about it like Dupin was, but I'm sure there was a lot more awareness of it that you could mine in letters and other sources where often we see philosophical tidbits surfaced from women.
We have a question here and one in the back. Yeah.
In this conversation about what is or what was then philosophy, where does Voltaire stand? I don't think he fits a traditional or academic category of a philosopher. So why should this be posed for Madame Dupin? I mean, you know, the category of philosopher, particularly in the 18th century, was very broad.
Yeah.
Social commentator of various kinds.
Exactly, exactly. And after all, I mean, of course, I'm the historian of philosophy, you know, who lives in that building over there, but Plato wrote in dialogues. I mean, he wrote in other forms that have been lost, or Montaigne's essays, or, you know, at some point, there's just many, many different ways of writing philosophy, which was well understood in the time. And it's kind of our, you know, more limited version as developed in the 20th century that allows us to even ask this question about some texts that are obviously philosophical. Yeah. Yes, Professor.
Hi. So I think it's worth pointing out that when Rousseau is talking about Diderot, he doesn't mention him by name either. So that's not necessarily that it's because she's
It's not a personal slight.
The question that I'd like to ask is about the relation between deciding not to publish and stopping work on the project. The explanations that I've seen, you know, tend to focus on not publishing with respect to the family's social profile and so forth, but that doesn't necessarily imply stopping work. And I'm sort of wondering, you know, whether she just completely puts it aside. You know, I'm looking at it. It's the dates that made me think this, right? We've got, you know, 47 years there, you know, between the last two dates. There's a long time there.
Yeah.
Did she just completely shelve it?
It seems that is the case. It seems that she completely shelved it. Anicet Sénéchal, to whom we owe so much, describes having opened some of the folios that he was cataloging, and there was still sand which was used for kind of drying ink, and coffee grounds, also used for that purpose, stuck between them, so that she had just filed them away and then not come back to them, which is very odd. So we don't really have a theory about that. We know, so there is a document at in Baltimore, what's that? Johns Hopkins University Libraries, that is called Inventaire de la Cave. And Inventaire de la Cave is what it sounds like on one side, which is her. It's weird that it's in her handwriting. Like, she didn't have a maître d'hôtel who was doing this, but like an inventory of, for example, her wine cellar. Wine cellars. Yeah. Lots. Champagne, lots. But on the other, if you flip the book around, like from the other direction, upside down and around, and start from the back, which is now the front, it's notes. And in 1754, she's taking notes on Rousseau's discourse on inequality. And I'm just like, what is she thinking? What is going through her mind? So she was still reading stuff kind of in the vein, I think, of she was still doing some research, but it doesn't seem like she was working.
Yeah, and there are other hands besides Rousseau's hands. So she had other secretaries there. They seem occasional rather than regular use, and they likely are from before Rousseau started with her. But it's possible that she continued a little bit after Rousseau left and had, you know, more production. And maybe, we don't know why she decided not to complete it. Even if we had the missing pieces, some of the final drafts just aren't final enough compared to the finalized ones. So yeah, that's a bit of a mystery. Unfortunately, her papers, many of her papers, not the manuscripts, but letters, and personal papers were burnt in 1793 when she was in Chenonceau, when the revolution was happening. Out of an extreme caution, a defrocked priest who was the guy who helped her run the chateau recommended it, apparently. So there's a lot missing. Maybe they're in letters where she described difficulties with completing it or worries that she'd be ridiculed, etc.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. So there's one there and maybe one last one if you'd like to.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work. This is really interesting. I have two questions, actually. One of them is regarding her influence on Rousseau. You mentioned instances where he's in dialogue with her, disagreeing with what she'd written. What, if any, were the instances that you found of sort of positive influence, or where it seemed like he was really in agreement with her and borrowed from her? And also, she seemed to have a lot of opinions, social critique on the institutions of marriage and education, and critiques. I'm wondering, did she have ideas for how they should be built?
I'll take the first, you take the second. Yeah. So if you look at that quote about the little vignette she has, I think it's the first quote on your handout. It's about the marriage scene. Rousseau has a very, very similar vignette about the rich man and the poor man on the social contract. So basically how this maps out is the rich man, right, wants to protect his resources, so he convinces the poor man that he will protect him and to give up everything else. So so the rich man corresponds to the husband, basically, and the poor to the wife. So he's sort of adopting that structure and that transfer of power and usurpation of freedom. But then women disappear from his equation. So it's sort of like he generalizes hers, and then he erases her and he erases women. Does that make sense? He generalizes that argument.
And I would say that the second question was it was about. No, I can't believe I already blinked on that.
Yeah, I had it.
No, but I had a.
Oh, what she wants.
Exactly.
Like her idealism. Yes.
Oh, so for education, unfortunately not. She has lots of criticisms of treatises of education, actual practices of education, and doesn't really offer an alternative. For marriage, though, she kind of does, the marriage relationship and the contract. She considers things like a short-term contract. All marriages should be time limited, and then you sign up again, kind of re-up if it's gone well. and really you re-up again up until your children are adults, and then you decide, now do we keep going or not? So that you'd have like 10 years, I think she says 10 and then 17, and then there's another point. So that's one kind of alternative. But really she imagines a kind of sweet and I guess egalitarian love relationship in marriage. She doesn't think that can really happen in the current conditions, but she thinks, and it's not just some utopic past, but it's something that one could get to. So, and some of that isn't in the